so today we're going to talk about research first principles. We're going to learn about kind of the foundations of research. So maybe like the first a third, 2/3 of the class really is just like fundamentally what is research, and we're just going to hammer that question from a variety of different perspectives. What we found, like in 404, for instance, I used to teach that class when I first got here, and I would like come out of the gates like, all right, we're going to do some research, and it would be like, what's research? It's like, oh, wow, okay, so students have never been exposed to what is academic research. When you pick up a textbook and you read that so-and-so found this and so-and-so found that, like where does that even come from, right? So it's just like laying that foundation at the beginning. We're gonna learn about marketing insofar as examples, right? So we'll bring in, I'll use examples from a variety of communication, journalism, IMC, media kind of stuff, right? So it's not going to be a marketing class per se because it's designed for students that are across the school in the 3 different majors that we have, but we will be talking about marketing insofar as we talk about those examples. Yeah, so Logan asked, did demographics matter when it comes to an article? We'll touch on that today, and we'll touch on that throughout the semester with respect to sort of research should be culturally sensitive. If you're going to study quote unquote all people, then your samples of those people should be representative of the population that you want to generalize to. So like medical research that for decades and decades and decades were done on white men, right? That doesn't necessarily translate to women or people of other races and ethnicities, right? And so we need to make sure that our research is demographically variable so that we can say we're drawing conclusions on a population or a sample that's representative of a larger population. Reagan asks, is any publicity good publicity? I love this question. No. Or maybe, I don't know, Cracker Barrel, is anybody following the debacle of Cracker Barrel? Like, is that good for Cracker Barrel to be getting all this news? They changed their logo, and then they were like, yeah, that was a bad idea, but then they also like renovated their whole interior of all their restaurants, so like they can't redo that, they can't like go back to, but they put it was a new logo, and then they went back to their old logo, right? So they teed off their base, basically, and their base was like not having anything to do with the new logo, right? And it's like, we have way too much time in this country to be spending on like what a logo. Like, does it really matter the logo? The food's terrible anyway. So, just kidding. I love Cracker Barrel. No question there. All right. Any other questions about course material? Anything with respect to the readings that sort of comes to mind before we start chatting about research first principles? A little bit more about me, about the class.
Did you listen to the new Deftones album?
No.
Do we have to take notes on this?
It'd be a good idea, because it'll be on the test. I did put the note pages up in case you want to take notes the old-fashioned way as well. So our topic today, I've called it First Principles Thinking. First Principles Thinking was developed in ancient Greece, so we're talking, right, way back when, 2,500, 30,000, 4,000, whatever years ago. And here's how it's defined. Talking about something that takes you 4 hours to read. It may take you 4 hours to read this paragraph written by Aristotle. He says, in every systematic inquiry, which is the Greek word methodos, where there are first principles or causes or elements, knowledge and science result from acquiring knowledge of these. For we think we know something just in case we acquire knowledge of the primary causes, the primary first principles, all the way to the elements. And I'm not going to read that whole thing to you because it begins like you're going to start to fall asleep. It was written in the 4th century BCE. And with all of those words, here's what Aristotle is basically saying. Real knowledge doesn't come from just memorizing facts. It comes from understanding what he calls and what others have called first principles. The basic causes, the basic assumptions, the basic building blocks of those facts. First principles are like common DNA. They hold across methods. We're going to learn these principles because they cut across regardless of whether you use numbers or words, whether you make observations of people's behavior or ask them directly in questionnaires. So divergences are like different species that we adapt to answer different kinds of questions, but the basic DNA, the first principles of research, stay the same. So when we learn, whether we're learning about research or about any other topic, we start with what feels obvious to us. Things we see, things we hear, things we assume in everyday life. But the real path of inquiry, as Aristotle says, is to move from what is clear to us to what is actually clear by nature, the deeper truths that explain why things are the way they are. So in this course, we'll follow the same road. We began with your everyday ideas about research, right? I asked you on that questionnaire to list up to 12 thoughts that you had when you hear the word research. Yep, straight to the right. So I asked you on that questionnaire, what is research? And you listed a bunch of thoughts, and basically I threw it into a program and generated this word cloud. So a lot of reading, data, writing, knowledge, search, study, examine, hypothesis, investigate, right? These kind of thoughts, right, that you have. So when you hear the word research, you already kind of have a sense of what that means. Maybe Google comes to mind. So we talked about research. When you choose a restaurant, when you decide whether to take a class, and you look up whether a product is worth buying, you do some kinds of research to make those decisions. And so you already have some understanding of the uses of research. You already have some understandings of what research is. And this course is designed to help you evaluate the research that you encounter, whether that research is in the form of a poll or campaign data, whether it comes in the form of a news story written by a journalist or a formal article or a report from an organization. And it's going to hopefully teach you to ask questions like, is the claim that they're forwarding, is the claim they're making well-founded? What's the evidence? Does it hold up to the evidence? What questions should I ask before accepting it? What questions should I ask the mechanic before accepting the $1,500 invoice to fix my transmission? What questions should I ask before taking the antibiotic from the doctor that I was prescribed to just simply get me out of the office? So I've got a set of first principles. Maybe you've printed out your notes and you also know what I'm going to say, but before I reveal my list, I'm kind of curious, if you're thinking about what you read in chapters 1 and 2 from your reading, what do you think are the principles that apply to research in the fields of journalism, I&C, and media communication? In other words, what makes research research? At least how we're going to use that term in this class.
If it can be tested.
Yeah, testable, right? And by testable, there was a word that was used to suggest that the kind of evidence that researchers use are measurable and observable. You remember that word? Started with an E. Empirical, right? What does empirical mean? Just means something you can, see, taste, touch, smell, put in your pocket, take home, show your mom. It's something that's observable, that's measurable, right? Empirical doesn't necessarily mean numbers. It just means something that you can test or observe with your senses, right? So research is empirical, it's testable. What else? What else did the book say about research?
They talked about how research has to kind of follow certain steps.
Yeah, systematic, right? There's a system to it, that there are steps that you follow, or that researchers have agreed we're going to follow these steps when we're doing this kind of research. In fact, that's the first principle that I have. Research is systematic, which means it follows a structured, intentional process rather than relying only on intuition or everyday observation. We're going to talk next week, and one of your readings for next week is about the power of intuition, the power of everyday observation in generating ideas. And we don't want to sort of eschew the creativity that's involved in the research process, but also we don't want to just say the kind of research that we want to think about as valid and reliable and scholarly, right, is not just the process of creation or thinking or intuition. It's more than that. It follows a system. So it follows a system. It attempts to minimize the influence of bias, and it involves what I'm going to call scientific thinking, but also I want to couch this idea of scientific thinking and kind of define it in a very specific way. And one of the reasons I like the textbook is because it does a really good job of outlining a variety of ways that we know things, and situating what we might call the scientific method as a broad kind of way of knowing about the world. So scientific thinking, if you kind of boil it down to its essence, and this isn't a philosophy class. If you want to take a philosophy class, I could recommend a few of them, right? So I'm not going to belabor the notion of justified true belief, but if you want to boil science down really to its essence, it's about truth. It's about discovering truths. This justified true belief theory describes what people count as knowledge. So for instance, when your friend says he knows that Michael Jordan is the best basketball player ever to live, or so-and-so is I know that so-and-so is the best quarterback ever in the NFL. Like Matt Leinart, best quarterback ever in the NFL. Or Ford is absolutely a better quality car than Chevrolet. When someone sort of claims knowledge, right, they don't do this sort of explicitly or even consciously, but they justify that knowledge, or what we might call a true belief, in some way. And the book outlines these. One of the reasons I like the book is because it draws from this guy named Charles Peirce, which is one of my favorite philosophers. You didn't ask me who my favorite philosopher was, but you did. It's Charles Peirce. Very sort of little known philosopher because a lot of his writings were never formally published, but he wrote volumes and volumes and volumes. And he's basically said that we fix our beliefs. We come to say that we know something or we believe something to be true in one of four different ways. And your textbook outlines these and uses a little bit different terms, right? The first way is what he calls tenacity. And your book uses, right, that terminology, tenacity, to basically is the holding of a belief without wavering, the resolve to continue to believe that thing irrespective of counter opinions. Right? You know people like this, right? That they are going to believe what they're going to believe, and it doesn't matter what you say, they still believe what they're going to believe. You may be one of these kinds of people with certain things. Like, I know Apple is the best computer. Don't try to convince me to get a PC. The iPhone, I have to have the iPhone, right? I don't want a Samsung or a non-iPhone. Like, don't even try to convince me, right, that this is it, right? I know this thing. Don't give me the evidence. Don't convince me with the data, right? I know, right? So to be tenacious or to fix your belief on tenacity, right, is sort of, it's almost impossible, at least for many of our beliefs, because unless we make ourselves hermits, right, we're necessarily going to bump into people who differ from us. We're necessarily going to be in interaction with other people that have different views and opinions and perspectives. And as we become open to those new perspectives, we might say, well, maybe I should consider, right, whatever it is. Maybe I should go out to eat and eat something other than a hamburger, right, or from the kids' menu, or whatever the case might be, right? And so instead of maybe my own preferences guiding my true belief, I use authority, right? And this was the case when you were growing up. It may still be to a certain extent the case now that the will of the state or some institution, whether that institution is your parents or that institution is the state of Mississippi or a church or a synagogue or some other sort of collection of beliefs and principles and practices, right? That what we want to do as an institution is keep correct doctrines. We want you to behave in these ways. Your parents are the institution to a certain point. Your church might be for some of you, or peers, or some other authority figure. Right? So we believe what we believe, and I said this quote last class period. C.S. Lewis is famous for saying like 99% of the things you believe are based on authority, because someone that you trust told you that thing, and so you become just to believe it, right? But again, right, you begin to understand that whatever authority it is that guides your beliefs isn't the authority that guides others' beliefs, and so you become to find out, oh wow, right? And maybe, I mean, for me, I'll just go ahead and out myself. That was, when I went to college, was one of the first times that I realized that, holy cow, there's so many beliefs, right? How in the world do these people believe these things, right? These are just mind-blowing that people can believe things other than the way I believe. And you start to question your beliefs, and you retain some of them, and you change some of them, or you forget that some of them are as important as they might have been. This is what Peirce calls the a priori method. It's what your book refers to as like intuition, right? Accepting information based on a gut feeling. Anybody sort of like, I just have a feeling, right? I have a gut feeling I should not do this, right? It feels good, therefore I'll do it, right? I know that when I drink X, right, I do my best, and when I drink Y, I don't do my best, and don't try to convince me with evidence, but it's just that, right, this works for me, and so I'm just going to keep doing this thing, right? So what's true for me is true for me, what's true for you, and we're all just going to get along, kind of a mentality. First kind of equates this with what I might call the coffee shop method. You go in and you just kind of, chatter around, and you figure out what makes sense to the group, and you say, that's what we're going to do, right? You don't check it with external evidence. You don't even check it against authority, right? You just go along because it makes sense, right? It just sort of, it's logical, right? So a lot of emotional things, when we're captured by emotion, when something just feels good, hedonic pleasure, we just sort of run with it. That is also captured in this, right, notion of the a priori method. But Peirce, in your book, and others go on to say that this kind of intuition causes too much doubt, and we need a way to fix belief by what Peirce says is nothing human, but by some external permanency, by something upon which our thinking has no effect. It must be something which affects or might affect every person. And although these affections are necessarily as various as our individual conditions, yet the method must be that the ultimate conclusion of every person shall be the same. That's the method of science. Irrespective of what you think, what you believe, science answers questions, right? And everyone that does the study this way and follows these methods will come to the same conclusion, right? That's the method of science. So when we think about the scientific method, you may think of like people in white coats pouring liquids into different beakers and lighting things on fire, right? That's what conjures up when we think of science, but really science is a rigorous attempt at truth. That's really all that science is. That's all the scientific method is. That's all scientific thinking is. And that's all we really mean when we say research is systematic, that it follows a scientific method, right? Again, it doesn't have to be numbers, right? It doesn't have to even be really large samples of people or situations. It can be case studies. But it's a rigorous, I mean, think of Aristotle, if you have taken a philosophy class, or if you will, Aristotle sort of would study one starfish, right? And he would try to figure out the essence of that one starfish, and then he would generalize to other, right, starfish, or whatever the object was. And you didn't have to study a bunch of them, you just had to study one of them, really in depth, really systematically, and really carefully. And that's what we're talking about in this first principle. Research is systematic. Right? So science is also, in addition to being systematic, to have a particular method that we follow, it's also cumulative. In other words, new studies build on prior knowledge. We connect what we already know, or what we think we know, to new evidence. And we talk about this again next week when we talk about literature reviews, and chapter 6 of your textbook covers that. When we go to the library 2 weeks from now and we start to think about how do we find sources to support some of the things that we want to do and our studies. This is all about sort of the cumulative nature of science. In order to know what kind of question to ask next, you got to know what happened before, because that question may have already been answered satisfactorily. We don't necessarily need to do a study to find out, right? Cracker Barrel probably could have known before they changed their logo that it was a bad idea. Probably didn't need to do a whole lot of research to figure that out, but guess what? They did it anyway, and then they had to backtrack. So you can see this idea of the cumulative nature of science, both in terms of Chapter 2 talked about the history of empirical research methods from the 16th century, and I'm not going to sit here and lecture about that because you'll fall asleep, right? But those methods in the 16th century were developed to study physical, natural phenomenon, all the way up through the early 1900s when those same methods were being developed to study empirically in psychology, sociology, anthropology, and eventually in communication and media studies. So the cumulative nature of science can be found in simply the origin of the specific methods that we use today that used to be used, right, a long, long time ago to discover natural laws, physical laws. You can also see the cumulative nature of research in specific theories. So one that I'll use to illustrate is agenda setting theories. Anybody ever heard of agenda setting theory? What does it sound like?
Making a plan.
Yeah, an agenda is a plan, right? The agenda setting theory basically says that news media, and this was developed at a time when like that meant something very specific, newspapers, CBS, ABC, and so forth, right? That news media, by choosing what to report and how prominently to report it, significantly influence the public's perception of what issues are important, thereby shaping what people think about, though not necessarily what they think. So the original idea was actually in a 1922 publication called Public Opinion by a guy by the name of Walter Lippmann. He framed it as, I don't know if he used the word agenda setting, but he framed this idea that one of the roles of the news media is basically to tell the public, here's what's important. Not what to think about those issues, but to say, here are the issues, public, that you need to be thinking about. So if you think about from the standpoint of what information that you've been exposed to from the University of Mississippi, right, this week, what is important according to the University of Mississippi this week? Game day. Trash cans. Yoga in the Grove on Friday. Right? That's what's important. It didn't tell you to cheer for Ole Miss. Maybe it did. Right? But at a baseline, it's like, here's what you need to know to be a successful Ole Miss student this week. And for faculty and staff, it's like, by the way, move your cars. Don't park after 6 o'clock. Right? And even university vehicles, right? Move them over to Jackson Avenue Center. Right? Those are the important things to understand. These are the issues you need to understand. So the original idea, 1922, but the first empirical study wasn't until 1972. I'm going to post the full article on Blackboard so you can have it. But I do have a handout of the methods section because a couple of the points I'm going to make are relevant for that, and we'll point to that. So you can sort of start to see the principles of research, not just in a textbook, but in an actual academic article. And although it is old, 1972, it's still relevant because this is one of the leading theories in media and communications. So the first empirical study, 1972, today there's hundreds, if not thousands of studies that have documented not only what they call first level agenda setting, which is this idea that the media tells us what things we should be thinking about, but also what they call now second level agenda setting, which is how to think about those things. And that's no surprise to you, having grown up in the media environment that you've grown up in, that certain media spin things in certain ways. And so if we watch exclusively one media versus another media, we tend to have that perspective on those particular issues. So the cumulative nature of science can be found not only in just generally the way science progresses again, from natural science to social science, but also in particular theories where someone comes up with an idea, someone then begins to test that idea with those methods, and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of studies later, we not only understand that media tell us what to think about, but also tells us exactly how to think about those things. So what agenda setting theory also helps to illustrate are a couple of other first principles. These are first principles 3 and 4, and I've called them conceptual clarity matters and measurement as purposeful. On the baseline questionnaire that you did at the beginning of the semester, the primary confusing concept or skill people didn't have a lot of grasp on was the difference between conceptualization and operationalization. You may not even have heard those terms before, right? Conceptualization and operationalization. Those are just fancy words for creating definitions at some abstract or theoretical level. I mean, just the word agenda setting in and of itself is a conceptual term, right? So conceptualization is abstract, theoretical. Operationalization is the process by which we take complex, abstract, theoretical concepts and we say, here's how we're going to measure them or observe them. And both of those things are important in science. So clear definitions are necessary to ensure we're studying the same thing and that we're studying what we say we're studying and not something else. And measurement is purposeful. How we measure variables shapes the quality and the meaning of the evidence that we gather. So in that agenda setting article that you have, and the excerpt you have in front of you, and the full article that I'll post on Blackboard later this afternoon, the original concept, right? The press may not tell us what to think, but it stunningly successfully tells us what to think about. Conceptually, this is salience. This idea of salience, the importance or the prominence of an issue in public consciousness. So what is salience? Well, conceptually, the media, something is salient if it's prominently presented in news coverage. What does it mean for something to be prominently presented in news coverage? What do you think that means? For instance, like if you've ever picked up an actual newspaper, what do you think that means?
It's on the front cover.
Front cover,
It's a lot.
they call it above the fold, right? Which again is getting a little bit lost in meaning because we don't have physical newspapers as much anymore, but newspapers are generally folded in half. You unfold it, right? So if it's sitting on the newsstand and you see, what you see on the newsstand is by definition of that newspaper, that's the most important thing, right? On a website, above the scroll. In a news, like Newswatch, right? What comes first, right? Where do they put all the stuff about like, oh, look at this puppy dog? They put that up front? They should, but no, they don't, right? They put it at the end. So they're telling you this doesn't matter as much. We're going to put the quote-unquote fluff pieces at the end. So conceptually, this idea of prominence operationally is where is it placed? How much do they talk about it? How many newspapers cover it, right? Public agenda, right? How important people perceive issues to be, which again, we can measure in a variety of ways. So this idea of salience, we've got to clearly define what we mean by salience, right? Salience is an abstract idea. To study it, we have to pin down what we mean by salience. Without a clear definition, agenda setting could mean anything from story frequency to prominence to personal concern. Without those definitions, agenda setting would be vague. Does it mean volume? Does it mean tone? Does it mean importance? Does it mean personal relevance? In the study that you have in front of you that we'll call the Chapel Hill study, media agenda was operationalized as, quote, the frequency and placement of issues in news coverage. So if you look at those methods, what you'll see is they did something called a content analysis. And again, that could be way over your head, and that's fine. We're going to talk about it later in the semester. And all that means is an analysis of the content of news media. It's literally just counting things that you find in the news media based on predetermined or predefined categories. So it was the frequency, how many, and the placement Again, above the fold, right below the fold, in the beginning of the news story, in the middle of the news story, at the end of the news story. And so that operationalization allowed McCombs and Shaw to compare media coverage with public opinion. This public agenda or public opinion was a survey. Participants ranked the most important problems that they thought were facing the country. But they just gave them a list of issues and they said, right, so this is very similar. Like if you've ever seen one of these national polls around the presidential election where it's like most people think the economy is most important. Most people think immigration is most important. Most people, right, all that, right, comes from these really early methods of trying to determine what do public think is important and how are media shifting those views. Later studies have refined those measures. Some have looked at front page coverage versus inside pages, amount of airtime. Some social media trending metrics are now oftentimes used and automated in terms of collecting those kind of data. Others have expanded surveys beyond most important to other kinds of scales that might measure salience. The point is, of course, if you don't define salience conceptually, then you risk talking past each other. Is it personal importance? Are we talking about media prominence? What are we talking about when we talk about salience? And then if you don't operationalize or measure that thing clearly, then you can't test theory. For example, measuring the media agenda by volume of coverage versus tone of coverage is going to lead to different results. And so one study finds, right, agenda setting exists. And another study finds media setting doesn't exist. Well, maybe they measure different things. Maybe they're defining their terms differently. Maybe they're operationalizing or measuring those constructs differently. And all of this has led to what I said earlier, second level agenda setting, which is an ongoing debate about how to best measure salience in the digital age. Does the media tell us how to think about things, or just does it only frame issues about what to think about? So agenda setting shows how research progresses when scholars carefully define and measure their constructs. The theory's growth is really a story about the importance of refining conceptual and operational definitions. So research is systematic, science is cumulative, conceptual clarity matters, measurement is purposeful. The other points that this article helps illustrate are 5 and 6. Inference is central and causality requires strong evidence. We're going to talk a lot this semester about inference making. What's an inference?
An assumption.
Yeah, what do you mean by assumption? Tell me a little bit more about that.
You make an educated guess on something that you know from past knowledge, and you assume something.
Yeah, or just a current observation, right? I see a pencil, right? What's the inference I can draw from just seeing that pencil? Somebody was there, right? I mean, it didn't just, just pop into existence, right? Inference is a process of assumption making. It's a process of going beyond the current observation to making assumptions, inferences, educated guesses, hypotheses about what's happening here. That's what research is about. It involves drawing justified conclusions from variables to concepts. Agenda setting theory, that article you have in front of you did not measure agenda setting. It didn't even measure salience, right? But it's making claims and inferences about those concepts, about those constructs. From samples to populations, how many people did they survey? How many newspapers did they look at? Where did they do their research? And then from data to relationships. Based on the data we have, we can make certain kind of claims about certain kinds of relationships, causality being one of those kinds of relationships. And over you're going to hear me say that correlation does not equal causation. Anybody ever heard that before? Correlation doesn't equal causation? Great. You're going to hear me say it a lot, right? And hopefully you'll hear it a lot more as we move on because it's true. Just because two things are associated. There's some really good websites out there, I can share them with you, that show all kinds of crazy, really, really high correlations between things, right? Like ice cream consumption and drowning are very, very highly correlated. So if you eat ice cream, you'll drown, right? So the existence of ice cream eating, like the frequency of ice cream eating, people eat more ice cream, right? So as that increases, so too does the number of people who drown. So the number of people who eat ice cream in the United States, as that goes up, the number of people who drown in the United States also goes up. Therefore, eating ice cream causes drowning. Why not?
Because the correlation doesn't equal the causation.
Because just because two things coexist doesn't mean that one thing caused the other thing. What is the third variable that might explain both of those things increasing?
Summer.
Summer, right? Summer gets here, we eat ice cream. Summer gets here, we swim. As you eat more ice cream, right? You don't drown, right? But as you swim, you're more likely to drown, right? As more people get into swimming pools and lakes and rivers and so forth, more drownings occur. And just because ice cream consumption moves along with that doesn't mean that it is the causal factor of that. There's a third variable, summer, that explains both of those. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So these inferences, right? Inference is central, right? So from variables to concepts, looking at media agenda, the number and placement of issue mentions in sampled outlets. The concept here being salience, how prominently issues are presented in the news. Public agenda, voter survey. The concept is issue importance for the public, right? So we're making inferences from the number and placement of issues to salience. We're making inferences from the number of survey rankings about important problems to issue importance for the public. And we're doing that, again, not using all media coverage of all issues of all time periods, right? Across history, right? In all countries. What did they do instead? Why is it called the Chapel Hill study?
It's only surveying Chapel Hill.
Because all it did was focus on Chapel Hill, North Carolina. That's it. Media outlets in Chapel Hill, people who lived in Chapel Hill, right? So from samples to population, you a lot of times think about it as people, sample of people, population of people. It's easy because you know the census maybe, right? Every 10 years we do a census, we're required to by the Constitution, right? People, but it's not just people that we sample, and it's not just the population of people that we care about. We care about people. So in this case, if you look at that method section, there were 100 undecided voters. So it's not even 100 voters. It's 100 undecided voters. So the generalization really is only to undecided voters who happen to live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, during the 1968 presidential election. That's it, right? That's the only real inference you can draw from that. But what we want to do is make a larger inference. Oh, look, the media, right, sets our agenda. So we make from that 100 decided voters an inference about the broader voting public. We also have a selection of outlets, so they looked at TV, newspaper, magazines, to make an inference about, quote unquote, the media. You hear this a lot, right? The media. The media's agenda. Even the mainstream media's agenda. Like, what does that even mean? Especially in today's day and age. Like, I don't even know what that means, the media. Right? Every single newspaper and television is biased toward a certain... No. Right? Many of them are. You know, and many of them are biased in another way, and many of them are relatively neutral. Right? But we've got this sense that the media are, the media are, the media are. What is the media? Again, the media set the agenda. Here we're just talking about TVs, newspapers, and magazines where? In Chapel Hill, North Carolina. That's it. Right? Not the media. And then we're talking about issues, right? Issues were a coded set of campaign topics. And we're trying to make inferences about what counts as public agenda. The public's agenda. Well, I only ask people about these, 14 topics. But that's the public's agenda, the inference that I'm trying to make. And then the context, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, inference about national patterns. And of course the authors talk about limitations. And then this, from data to relationships, that there was a strong correlation between sampled media coverage and sampled public priorities. But just because that relationship exists doesn't mean that it's causal necessarily. And they make a clear statement in that article that you'll see the full article on Blackboard. They say, eschewing causal language, comma, right? And then they begin their discussion of the issues. So every inference that we make rests on the assumption that these samples represent something larger. All voters, all media, all issues, the nation. Inference isn't just about people. It applies to outlets, it applies to issues, it applies to contexts. It applies to anything that you could sample. Any larger population. So before Target rolls out some brand new line of clothing, what do?
Research.
How do they research? How do they know whether that line of clothing is going to do great in all of their stores? They just put it in there?
They like check their other like sales and stuff maybe?
They check their other sales? They might survey?
See what clothes are trending.
Could see what clothes are trending?
Outperform other stores.
Yeah, they put it in some stores, and if it performs well, they put it in other stores. They do a sample. They don't say, oh, that's a great idea. Let's spend $10 million and roll that out to every single store across America. Right? It's why that you're going to find certain things in this Kroger that you won't find at other Krogers and at other Krogers and other Krogers, because they know it works well here, but not necessarily right there. So inference is multi-layered, and causality requires strong evidence. So even if media and public salience are correlated, what can we really infer about cause and effect? Well, we don't know the extent to which media coverage preceded changes in public opinion because it was all done at one time period. So we don't have a temporal order in those two variables. There is an association, but there are also other explanations. So public opinion could drive media coverage, for instance, right? The media could care about what people think, and based on what people think, they could be designing their media coverage. So there's certainly some reciprocal causation that's possible. And McCombs and Shaw were careful. They talked about agenda-setting effects, but emphasized the need for more evidence before claiming causation. So the Chapel Hill study illustrates sampling. It lets us study part of the public, part of the news, part of the United States, and infer about the whole. It illustrates inference, which is the process of building meaning across variables, populations, relationships, and constructs. It illustrates causality, that is tempting, but requires stricter evidence in the form of experiments. And we'll certainly talk about experiments this semester. So good research is cumulative. Later agenda-setting studies have tested stronger designs like time-lagged panel data experiments that move from simple correlation to more complex inferences about causation. And again, if any of this is fuzzy, it's because we're going to talk about this. These are the things that we're talking about during the semester. I'm just trying to set up the principles before we get there. So those are the first 6 principles. These next 3 principles, ethics guide all research, culture shapes research, and research must account for diverse perspectives and identity, sort of all are wrapped around basically researchers not only have to be careful in their methods and in the inferences that they're making, but in, if you're dealing with people, the treatment of people. And we'll talk about this again when we talk about ethics, if you've heard of the Tuskegee experiments, right? If you've heard of experiments that were done in California where they told Hispanic women that they were going to get birth control and they gave them a sugar pill and they got pregnant. Oops. Tuskegee, they left black men untreated from syphilis and saw what happened to them. So ethics is paramount. Respect for participants. More famously and less egregious is the Facebook emotion study. Does anybody know what I'm talking about there? Ever heard of that? Done by some communication researchers out of Cornell. And basically what they did is they randomly took away or added emotional content to people's Facebook feeds without their knowledge to see if subsequent posts that they posted were more or less positive or negative in nature. So this idea that emotional contagion happens through social media sites, they studied that through Facebook.
Can you go to the last slide? Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So whether we're doing medical research or non-medical research, we've still got to respect the dignity of people. We've got to let them know what's going on. We can't do things that are potentially harmful to them. Culture shapes research. So what we study, the questions that we ask, how we study that, the methods that we use, how we interpret our findings, the results and the discussions of our articles, they're all shaped by our cultural lenses. Research traditions aren't universal. They grow out of specific cultural and historical contexts. Chapter 2 does a good job of giving that historical context. The media and communication, journalism, and IMC that you know is a growth of communication research in the United States, primarily tied to mass media and social science methods, propaganda, and persuasion post-World War II. There's an emphasis there on persuasion, on effects, on quantitative, empirical, and experimental studies of media. In Europe, there's a stronger tradition of critical and cultural studies, a focus on ideology, power, representation, and meaning in media. And in many Asian countries, including China and Korea, programs emphasize almost exclusively mass communication. There's little to no attention on interpersonal or small group communication. Degrees are all about mass communication, whereas in the United States, there's quite a bit of variability in terms of being able to get communication degrees across that landscape. So what counts as research? Again, the questions we ask, the methods we privilege, the interpretations we value look very differently depending on the cultural and institutional contexts within which we sit. Culture doesn't just influence research participants and individual researchers, but it also shapes entire fields of study. A little bit different than that is this ninth principle, which is research must account for diverse perspectives and identities. So in addition to the fact that I study X and another person who grew up over here studies Y, right, and that's just dependent on culture, regardless of whether you grew up here, there, or elsewhere, valid, relevant research includes voices from across race, gender, culture, ability, and so forth. So excluding groups leads to flawed conclusions, like the early medical research based mostly on men. In media and communication, as in psychology, the tendency is to do research on college students because you're here and you have to do 10 research studies in order to get a credit in a psychology. Anybody had a psychology class yet? Did you have to do a bunch of studies you signed up for, had to go to the lab and do kind of stuff? No? What? Okay. Maybe they've changed it, but it's pretty standard fare where you have to do like 10 studies in a given semester, and most of that, right, is those people in that department doing that research. But understanding what college students do may or may not translate right to the everyday person that we might be wanting to draw inferences about. So diversity strengthens generalizability. It ensures findings matter more than to a narrow slice of society. And so we're talking about doing no harm, respecting participants with ethics. With culture, we're talking about recognizing the lens through which questions and answers are framed. And with diversity of perspective, we're talking about ensuring research that reflects multiple voices, not just the dominant ones. So the key takeaway here is that good research is not only systematic and rigorous, it's also responsible, culturally aware, and inclusive. And not just because those are values necessarily we want to uphold, but because that's good research. Irrespective of the current zeitgeist around DEI being an evil term, which is like, I can't even talk about diversity anymore. It's like, I'm not even, like, just take that off the shelf. Good research includes multiple people from multiple ethnicities, races, genders, and so forth, because you want to be able to generalize to those people. You don't only want to understand college kids. You don't only want to understand men between the ages of 35 and 44. You don't only want to understand fill in the blank. Unless fill in the blank is unique to that particular population, and then you might go do a study about that particular population. And our final principle, thank God we're going to leave soon. Our final principle is claims must be evaluated critically. The entire course is about helping you become a more critical consumer of the research that you encounter on a daily basis. Every day you encounter claims. In the news, in ads, on social media. And the question is, are those claims supported by solid evidence? Are the inferences that these researchers or this media outlet or this social media influencer, are those inferences that they're drawing, are they supported by the evidence that's in that article? Or are they making wild claims from data that have no bearing on that particular population, that particular setting, or whatever the case might be? So by the end of the semester, you'll have the tools, A, to understand the words that just came out of my mouth if you don't, and B, to recognize strong, weak research, spot weak arguments, ask sharper questions about the information you encounter. And that's the whole point. How do we make you more critical consumers of research? And I would argue that these 10 principles are fundamental and foundational regardless of whether you're going to do a survey, an experiment, a content analysis, a case study, a focus group, a set of in-depth interviews, a critical or cultural study, an ethnography, or anything else that you might come up with. Regardless of whether you're studying a single case or multiple cases, you care about generalizability. Regardless of whether you're doing a quantitative or a so-called qualitative study, you still care about making inferences beyond that one person, that one group, that one case, right? If you're doing a case study about Boeing, you don't necessarily only care about Boeing. You care about what it teaches you about the airline industry. What does it teach you about IMC? What does it teach you about leadership? What does it teach you about, right? And as soon as you start making those more broad, more abstract, more conceptual kinds of statements, you're moving beyond your data, moving beyond your study, moving beyond your variables, beyond your measurements, right? Then you're sort of, are you right to do that? Or should you backtrack and put in some qualifications? And journalists are more or less good at this, right? When you read a news story, right, a lot of times if it's in a sort of a not so good of an outlet, it'll be these grandiose claims that, you go back to the studies like they had 3 people. What in the world are they claiming, right? Or they talk about causality and it's just a correlational study. And some of that isn't the fault of the journalists themselves. Some of that, the journalists right nowadays, right, you submit your story and guess who gets to pick the headline? Not the journalist, not even the editor sometimes. It's like the person that puts it on, and if you ever notice that, the title of an article is different online than it is in the print publication. It's because online, it's clickbait. It's like, how do we get people to click this thing, right? So sometimes, we might want to blame the journalist when it's really not the journalist. The journalist did a great job in the story. It's just that the headline that was conjured up by the marketing department or by the SEO specialist or by whoever it is that put it up on the website that may not be a marketing specialist at all. Not all marketers are evil, right? It may just be that someone's like, ooh, this will be catchy, right? And they don't even think about the ramifications in terms of causality or the claims or the inferences or whatever the case might be. So these are our first principles. Good research is not just looking things up. It's not just having a question and going to Google or ChatGPT or even your local library, coming up with a few sources and writing a few paragraphs and then I'm done. It's a disciplined way of answering questions. What counts as discipline depends on who's doing the research and why, and that's shaped by history and culture. What we count as disciplined systematic research today, vastly different than what was counted as disciplined systematic research 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. We have different methods, we have different standards, we have different ways of counting things as high quality research. So these 10 principles, and I've organized them into 4 pillars, will help you become better critical thinkers by understanding the systematicity that's involved in research, the cumulative nature of science, the criteria by which you can critically evaluate claims. It'll help you understand the need for clear definitions, conceptually, operationally, and inferentially. It'll help you understand the need for ethical research, both in terms of the principles of respect and benevolence that we'll talk about when we talk about ethics, as well as the idea that if we're going to make claims like causality, there's ethical components to that. We can't tell people to take this pill if we have only correlational evidence that that pill works or is associated with things. And then we'll hopefully establish some cultural proficiency, the idea that culture shapes research and that research must account for diverse perspectives and identities. Some of this was in chapters 1 and 2. Some of this is me pontificating about what I have seen after having developed this class and thinking toward when you leave this class, what do I want you to take with you? It's this. Like if all that you take from the class is this, I'm like, good. Right? At least I did that. Right? You might not know how to do a content analysis. You might not be able to look at a questionnaire and immediately see all the problems in the double-barreled questions and these kinds of things. You might not be able to immediately understand the nuances of all the critical cultural kinds of studies that we're going to talk about later in the semester. But we're going to give you some vocabulary. We're going to give you an introduction to those concepts. We're going to start to see, again, the diversity, the species, right? If these principles are the DNA, the methods themselves are the species, right? Sort of the evolution of these principles. But regardless of the method, regardless of the kind of research that you're doing, these are the principles that guide the way. And what we'll do throughout the semester is say, hey, so what we're talking about, for instance, Tuesday next week is mainly going to cover critical thinking, and that's going to be true for a couple of days, right, next week and the week after that, right? And then we'll get into these other questions, comments, clarifications, aha moments. What'd you learn today?
Principles of research.
What does that mean? What is a principle of research? What does that mean to have a principle, a first principle?
To get in depth, and have a better understanding to research what
Yeah.
qualities that comes within research.
Yeah. What else? Yeah, you can keep those.
Okay.
Just make it for you.
Thank you.
What else? One thing you learned today.
You need to be inclusive with your research.
Okay. Research needs to be inclusive. Why? Why is that important?
So that you can have ideas and like different points of every single type of person.
Yeah. If you want to make claims about a whole bunch of people, you need to include a whole bunch of people. What else? What'd you learn?
Different people have obscure viewpoints. So you have to try to clarify what you mean for the broader perspective.
Yeah, if you're using a term and you have 100 people in a room, chances are you got 100 different ways in which that term is going to be defined conceptually, and then based on those conceptualizations, there's thousands of different ways that you might operationalize or measure those things, right? So continue to think about these things. Email me with questions when things are confusing. Otherwise, for Tuesday, you'll read 2 articles, nothing in your textbook, right? 2 articles, one by a woman by the name of Jan Babelis, who talks about the nature of creativity in science, and the other is less creative but necessary, and outlines sort of what a good research question is, and that's really our topic for Tuesday, is what is a good research question. So we'll start there on Tuesday. So there's a reading check due at 11:30 on Tuesday. Your week 1 evaluation reflection, that link will be sent out to you sometime this afternoon, so complete that by 5 p.m. tomorrow. So those 2 things are due before class on Tuesday. And then one question for me is anybody having trouble getting the textbook? One person emailed me. Who emailed me? You're having trouble with back order? Anybody else have trouble getting the textbook? Same back order?
Yeah.
Back order.
I found it on Amazon.
Yeah, I was looking online for it.
You did find it on Amazon?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I did try looking
So
online.
if you want to order from the evil overlord of Amazon, you can do that. I'm just joking. It's like you can't help it.
I think
right?
Thrift Books had it too,
Yeah.
that website, but
Yeah.
just check.
Yeah, you may have to do those things. Does the bookstore not have it?
It said out of stock or back ordered for the 4th edition. You said 4th edition.
Yeah. I don't know what the difference
So-
is with the 3rd edition, so I
Oh,
can't.
okay.
I just don't know. Like, it could be different, it could not be different.
Yeah.
I just don't know that. I
But
have
in
the 4th
terms of
edition.
that specific one, it's the bookstore now.
All right, so I've already uploaded chapter 6, which is for next Thursday's class, the PDF. So if I have to scan the entire book, that's what we'll do. It's not your fault that they don't have the books. So I'll keep scanning if you keep not being able to get the book until someone says back order is off. And I'll contact them and ask what the heck's going on with the back order. So all right, y'all have a great weekend. See you on Tuesday.